I guess, just kind of an aside, it's also like good Muslim, bad Muslim. It's like whether or not you're pro Saudi or not also kind of
Yeah.
factors into that, because the U.S. can never like break its alliance with Saudi Arabia, no matter what it says about any Muslim country. The like human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia never get covered. There was an excellent piece actually by Adam Johnson from Citations Needed. He wrote a little bit about that, talking about how Vice News is basically like a pro-Saudi, like pro-Saudi outlet now because of its cover. I mean, how it covers countries like Cuba as like this dictatorial regime, or there's
Right.
shadow police. There's always this kind of double standard. And I kind of want to think a little bit about this present moment and going back to how we began this conversation. And Jen and I each have one final question that we want to ask you. My question is looking at how the withdrawal from Afghanistan, is really kind of a strategic move on behalf of Biden, because he even said this in his speech. He's like, we need to refocus our energy towards China, because China is now the number one threat. And there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot to this. It might need its own episode at some point, and we've talked a lot about it here, and internally with the Red Nation, but also, looking at the new Cold War and what it's really kind of entailing and drawing the United States into. China is now has surpassed the United States in terms of GDP and wealth. That was a recent kind of news story that didn't really make much headlines. And so in many ways, we're seeing the end of the so-called American century. The United States is a declining superpower, but nonetheless remains equally dangerous, if not more dangerous today than it was the day that Biden withdrew troops from Afghanistan. Because much like during Reconstruction, when Grant withdrew troops, or not Grant, but when they withdrew troops from the South, that were overseeing the Reconstruction era, they didn't just disappear, right? They moved westward to begin a campaign of extermination and westward expansion into the western part of what is now the United States. The same could be said about Afghanistan. Those troops didn't just disappear in this failed nation building project in Afghanistan. They were redeployed. Many of them were redeployed into the Pacific, but they're fighting an enemy that is a state actor, right? And that we don't really have an officially declared war on yet. It's like it's a Cold War in that sense. And so there are a lot of different factors, and so it's been more exploding into the realm of what we call, or what we understand as hybrid warfare, because the strategic interest cannot be solved within the battlefield. It'd be devastating for the entire planet if China and the United States went to war. But nonetheless, it means that the United States is still going after implementing sanctions against its perceived or China's perceived allies in Latin America, or across the globe. The United States is implementing sanctions against about 1/3 of the population of the planet. And the United States used to be kind of one of the main hegemons in terms of pushing these IMF loans onto countries, and now China is becoming the preferred lender because of its less punitive kind of loan agreements and debt repayment. And so you have all of this restructuring, and so the United States is kind of grasping at straws in the sense that it's saying that the China is the new barbarians and the new anti-Muslim barbarians for what they're allegedly doing to the Uyghur minority population in Xinjiang. And the rest of the country is like, so when did the United States actually care about Muslims? Do you not remember the
Yeah.
last, the war on terror? This is a big question, but you said earlier that we may be seeing the kind of end of the U.S. war on terror era, and we may be transitioning into another one. And I just want to hear your thoughts on like what this new kind of pivot towards Asia and the kind of marshaling of resources and the institutions that were created and built up during the war on terror, and how it's kind of like where do you see this going? I mean, what's happening and what should we be paying attention to?
Well, this is a I think a vital and important question. I mean, I'm not an East Asia specialist to know exactly, how U.S.-China policy is working on the ground, but I think you're right that it is important to see this as another chapter, or as having some continuities with the global war on terrorism, but it's in a different frame, as you point out, against a state actor. Um, so it is a little bit like the Cold War in that there is a super state, a superpower with its affiliates and allies that have been created through commercial and other geopolitical relationships. China's Belt and Road Initiative, has forged connections and interdependencies with a wide range of, states, former communist bloc states, as well as third world states, the global south. And in fact, I think you're absolutely right that China has become an alternative, is providing an alternative system to that so-called rules-based order. In fact, all that the U.S. is and Europe and the U.S. are, trying to promote as the only basis for a peaceful global world, that you have to be part of this so-called rules-based order. But in fact, actually, all of these countries that are under sanctions, and you point out so rightly that there are hundreds of millions of people, billions of people who are suffering under essentially what the global war on terror did to enemy combatants in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, say that you are out of the conventions, the international protections, that rules-based order of Geneva Conventions. So none of those protections apply to you. We can detain you without charge. We can torture you. You are outside of the law, right? And so the rogue states, it starts with that axis of evil, a speech in some ways from the global war on terrorism, where George Bush kind of announced the global war of terrorism as targeting these rogue states, an axis of evil. So all of these countries, Venezuela, Iran, Syria, they are subject then to this punitive regime where they are evicted from this kind of rules-based order. They cannot, finance anything. They cannot participate and pursue their interests, and instead they are under blockade, under sanction, under various kinds of controls and isolation. And really, the only alternative they have is to join with the other rogue states, as friends of the charter, of the UN Charter. This is a very interesting development. I heard Vijay Prashad talking about it very eloquently, about this new movement, which is a recognition of reality that there are a number of countries that have to band together and are making an appeal for following the UN Charter, because the US is the one that's acting, and its allies are acting as the rogue states that aren't recognizing nation-state sovereignty. They're trying to create an entirely different international system that doesn't abide by the UN Charter. So we see that also with the only advantage that the United States seems to have during this kind of period of decline that I think you rightly point out, is the fact that it is so invested in its military infrastructure and technology that is almost the only industrial part of the U.S. economy in which it has a competitive advantage. China's economy and technology are developing rapidly. They have their own kind of social media. They have their own, Amazon, Alibaba is massive as a, internet, commercial space. So they are presenting an alternative that is truly a rival to U.S. hegemony. And that, I think, is what's really fueling it. So we see this AUKUS pact, which is a resurrection of these Cold War pacts that the U.S. sponsored, these regional defense agreements and treaties, like SEATO. I mean, this is basically like SEATO, And, of course, there was NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, but then they sponsored the Baghdad Pact. They, sponsored the Manila Pact that created SEATO, which was a way of not only creating a military alliance, but I think really fundamentally providing a market, a closed market for U.S. military technology, because this is the only, area. So they're trying to enforce a kind of monopoly in almost the only area of technology and industry that they have a competitive advantage. So they're trying to protect it by creating a military pact that makes, Australia, have to purchase U.S. nuclear submarines and U.S. military technology, and not just the technology, but also the servicing, kinds of agreements. The, you have to have command structures that work across different nations if you're part of a military pact like this. So what we see is that this is a geopolitical, military, and commercial alliance in response to the growth of China and the fact that an alternate system is starting to emerge around the globe.